There is a specific frequency to the sound of a human skull hitting cast iron, a dull, wet thud that doesn't echo so much as it absorbs all the remaining oxygen in a room. I am staring at the small, rusted flake of metal embedded in the grout between our bathroom tiles, and I am listening to the silence that followed that sound. On the floor, stretched between the clawfoot tub and the porcelain pedestal of the sink, my wife's fingers are still twitching, just a little, like the legs of a dying beetle turned on its back. The water in the tub is still running, a steady, lukewarm stream that has already begun to spill over the porcelain lip, darkening the hem of her linen trousers into a deep, bruised purple. I have exactly 4 minutes before the downstairs neighbor, a retired acoustic engineer named Mr. Henderson, who complains if I drop a coin on the hardwood, notices the rhythmic drip, drip, drip through his ceiling plaster. I didn't push her, but if I call 911 right now, the operator will ask me to state my name, and I will say Julian Vance, and I will tell them I'm 34 years old, and then they will look at the trajectory of the blood spatter on the radiator, and they will think about the life insurance policy we signed 3 weeks ago in the mahogany-paneled office on Market Street. They won't see the letters. They won't know about the attic. They will only see a husband, a wet floor, and a woman who knew too much about the quiet spaces between walls. Let's go back exactly 7 months, to the day the air in our house changed. We live in Savannah, Georgia, in one of those historic brick townhouses where the humidity doesn't just sit in the air, it clings to your skin like a wet wool blanket, forcing you to breathe slowly, to think slowly. The house belonged to Clara's family, the de Morvilles, a name that carries the faint, sour smell of old money and older secrets. When her grandfather died, he left her the property on the condition that we never sell it to a developer. We were happy then, or at least we possessed the perfect, frictionless imitation of happiness that passes for the real thing in the American suburbs. I am an archivist for the State Historical Society. My entire life is spent handling things that have already ended, organizing the dead into acid-free boxes. Clara was a landscape architect, a woman who looked at chaotic, tangled dirt and saw lines, symmetry, and control. Julian, she had said to me that morning, her voice drifting down from the third-floor landing, light and thin, like a thread of silk caught in a draft. There's something stuck behind the baseboard in the linen closet. It's rattling when the laundry spin cycle hits. I remember looking up for my coffee. The sunlight was hitting her face through the stained glass transom above the front door, cutting her features into sharp, amethyst-colored angles. She looked beautiful, but she looked translucent, the way she always did when the southern heat started to peak in late August. "Leave it," I muttered, turning a page of the manuscript I was translating. "The house is 140 years old, Clara. If we investigated every rattle, we'd be living in a pile of sawdust by winter." But Clara wasn't a person who left things alone. She had an administrative soul. She needed the world to be flush, level, and accounted for. An hour later, I heard the screech of a crowbar. It wasn't the sound of a woman fixing a rattle. It was the sound of someone tearing into something with a sudden, violent appetite. When I reached the third floor, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the scent of old wood or dust. It was the smell of dry rot mixed with something sweet, like dried lavender that had been soaked in kerosene and left to curdle in a dark drawer. Clara was sitting on her heels on the bare pine floorboards. Around her lay splinters of old, white-painted cedar. She had torn away an entire 4-foot section of the wainscoting, revealing the hollow, soot-blackened void between the inner wall and the exterior brickwork. Her hands were covered in gray soot, and her fingernails were bleeding where she had clawed at the lath. In her lap sat a small, rectangular tin box, the kind they used to sell loose-leaf tea in during the 1950s. The lithographed picture of a smiling English monarch on the lid was half-eaten by rust, but the seal, a thick, black band of electrical tape, was perfectly intact. "Look," she whispered. She didn't look up at me. Her eyes were fixed on the black tape. It was wedged behind the stud. Someone didn't just drop it down there, Julian. Someone built a false back into the closet to hide it. "Clara, it's probably old tax receipts or plumbing bills from her grandfather," I said, though my stomach did a strange, cold flip. In my line of work, you learn that people don't use 3 layers of industrial sealant to preserve a gas bill. They use it to keep the air out, or to keep something else in. She didn't wait for my permission. She didn't ask for a knife. She used her teeth to catch the edge of the old electrical tape, peeling it back with a slow, agonizing screech that made the hairs on my arm stand up. The smell that escaped the tin when the lid gave way was instantaneous. It was the smell of copper, old coins, and dry grease. Inside were three things. First, a bundle of letters tied with a thick, greasy leather thong. The paper wasn't old parchment. It was cheap, yellowed legal pad paper from the 1980s. The blue lines faded into faint ghost tracks. Second, a heavy, silver-plated signet ring bearing a crest that didn't belong to the de Morville family. A stylized vulture holding an hourglass in its beak. And third, a small black-and-white photograph of a child. The child was sitting on a wooden porch that looked remarkably like our own back veranda, but the background was entirely blurred out, as if the photographer had intentionally used a lens that distorted everything except the subject. The boy couldn't have been more than 4 years old. He was wearing an oversized wool sweater, and his eyes were wide, white, and completely devoid of pupils. It was a printing error, surely, a flash reflection or a chemical stain during the development process in some darkroom 40 years ago. But when you looked at it long enough, it didn't look like a mistake. It looked like he was looking through the paper, through the room, through us. "Who is this?" Clara whispered, her thumb brushing against the silver ring. "Julian. My grandfather didn't have any brothers. My mother was an only child, who lived in this house in 1982. "I don't know," I said, reaching out to take the tin from her. My hand was shaking, just a little, a microscopic tremor that I hope she didn't notice. "But it's not our business. It belongs to the estate. We should put in the safe downstairs and call the lawyer on Monday." She looked up then, and for the first time in the 7 years we had been married, I didn't recognize the expression in her eyes. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, calculating recognition, as if she had just found a missing piece of a puzzle she had been working on in secret for her entire life. "No," she said softly, pulling the tin back against her chest. "This doesn't belong to the estate, Julian. This belongs to me. Look at the handwriting on the top letter." I leaned closer, the heat of the attic space pressing down on my neck like a physical hand. The top sheet of the yellow legal pad had only 3 sentences written on it, in a cramped, shaky cursive that looked like it had been executed by someone whose hand was being forced. "The water is rising in the cellar again. He says if I tell the man from the church, he'll make the floor level with my face. Don't look for the boy under the willow." The handwriting was Clara's, not her mother's, not her grandfather's. It was the exact, distinct script she used every morning to write our grocery lists on the refrigerator whiteboard. The unique, slightly elongated G's, the sharp, defensive cross on the T's. But the paper was 40 years old. The ink was a brand of ballpoint blue that hadn't been manufactured since the Carter administration. And in 1982, Clara hadn't even been born yet. That was the setup. That was the moment the floor beneath our feet began to tilt, so slowly that we didn't realize we were sliding into the dark until the light from the windows was already gone. During the weeks that followed, the house changed from a sanctuary into a chronological trap. Clara stopped going to her office at the firm. She spent her days in the dining room, the large mahogany table covered in city plat maps, old property titles from the county courthouse, and medical registries from the late 20th century. She didn't wash her hair. She smelled faintly of the attic dust, a dry, chalky odor that seemed to emanate from her pores. "It's an architectural anomaly," she told me one night around 3 in the morning. I had come down to find her sitting in the dark, the only illumination coming from the blue glare of her laptop screen. "The tax records say this house has 4,000 square feet of livable space, Julian. But I've measured the exterior walls. I've done the math 3 times. There are 82 square feet missing between the kitchen pantry and the old coal cellar." "Houses settle, Clara," I said, my voice thick with exhaustion. I stood in the doorway, holding a glass of water that felt heavy as lead. "The walls are 3 layers of brick thick. There are chimneys that were sealed over in the 20s. It's just dead space." "Dead space doesn't have a pulse," she said. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just stared at the screen, where a digitized map of our neighborhood from 1984 showed a small, rectangular outbuilding in our backyard that no longer existed, a structure labeled simply as the annex. "What are you talking about, a pulse?" I asked, stepping into the room. The air felt colder near the table, a distinct drop in temperature that made the water in my glass shimmer slightly. "If you sit on the floor in the pantry," she whispered, her voice rhythmic, almost hypnotic, "around 2 in the morning, when a streetcar line shuts down, you can hear it. It's not a heartbeat, Julian. It's a breath. A long, wet intake of air, then 20 seconds of nothing. Then it lets go. You're not sleeping," I said, coming up behind her, putting my hands on her shoulders. Her skin felt like marble, hard, dry, and unnaturally cold. "You're having auditory hallucinations from the stress. We've been through this before, Clara. After your mother died, you start fixing on things. You start creating patterns because the real world feels too random." She twisted out from under my hands with a sudden, jerky movement that felt entirely uncharacteristic of her usual grace. She stood up, facing me, her face pale in the screen glow. "Don't gaslight me, Julian," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Don't use my mother to make me think I'm losing my mind. I know what you do at the Historical Society. I know what you spend your afternoons looking at." My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to expand, the corners stretching away into the dark. "What is that supposed to mean?" "The archivist," she sneered, and for a second, her face looked exactly like the pupilless boy in the photograph. Blank, hostile, and utterly vacant. "The man who organizes the past so it can't hurt anyone. You knew about the tin before I found it, didn't you? You knew why my grandfather left us this house. You knew what happened here in '82. "I don't know anything about '82, I said, but my voice sounded thin, even to myself. It was the voice of a man who was lying, or worse, a man who was beginning to suspect that his own memories were just another layer of old wallpaper that had been pasted over something hideous. "Then explain this," she said, snapping her laptop shut. In the sudden darkness, before my eyes could adjust, she reached out and pressed something into my palm. It was small, cold, and heavy. The silver signet ring from the tin. The vulture with the hourglass. "I found the invoice from the jeweler," she whispered from the gloom. "It wasn't in the tin. It was in your desk drawer downstairs, Julian, underneath your college transcripts. The ring was purchased 4 months ago, and the credit card used to buy it was yours. The water is still running in the bathroom. It's higher now, a thin sheet of silver that has crept out of the doorway and onto the hall runner, turning the antique Persian wool into a dark, sodden sponge." I look at Clara's hand on the tile. The twitching has stopped. Her fingers are curled into a loose fist, as if she is still holding onto the last second of her life, refusing to let it go. If I run, I look guilty. If I stay, I have to explain why my wife's blood is on a radiator that I supposedly repaired last Tuesday. I have to explain why the handwriting from 1982 matches the note I found in her coat pocket tonight. The note that told her to meet me in the bathroom at midnight with the tub full. But most of all, I have to explain the sound that is coming from the floorboards beneath her head right now. It's not the neighbor's drip. It's a long, wet intake of air. Then 20 seconds of nothing. Then let's go. The wet wool of the Persian rug doesn't just absorb the water. It drinks it with a faint, hissing sound, like hot iron dipped in grease. I am kneeling now, not because I want to be closer to Clara, but because my knees have turned into something resembling wet cardboard. The human body contains roughly 5 liters of blood, and when it mixes with lukewarm city water on historical white grout, it looks remarkably like cheap cherry syrup from a soda fountain. It spreads in long, delicate tendrils, following the microscopic fractures in the cement, mapping out the imperfections of the floor. I have 3 minutes left before Mr. Henderson's ceiling begins to weep. My phone is in my left trouser pocket. It feels heavy, like a smooth river stone. I could pull it out, slide my thumb across the glass, and dial those 3 digits. The dispatcher would be a woman, probably mid-40s, her voice flat with the institutional exhaustion of the Chatham County Emergency Services. She would ask for my location, and I would give her the address. 214 East Jones Street. A good address. A historic address. My wife fell. I would tell her. My voice would shake, and it wouldn't be an act. She hit her head on the radiator. There's a lot of water. And then the police would arrive. They wouldn't come with sirens blaring. Not on Jones Street. Not at 2 in the morning. They would arrive with the quiet, methodical malice of men who have seen too many domestic accidents that occur precisely when the market was down and the life insurance policy was up. They would look at my hands. They would look at the skin beneath Clara's fingernails. And then they would look at the closet. The transition from suspicion to certainty is never a straight line. It's a staircase you descend in the dark, convinced there's one more step until your heel drops into nothingness. After the night Clara handed me that silver signet ring, the one she claimed I bought with my own credit card, the house stopped being a structure of wood and brick. It became an adversary. Every morning, I would wake up at 4, my mouth dry, the taste of copper sitting on the back of my tongue like an old penny. Clara wouldn't be in bed. The sheets on her side would be cold, stiff, and perfectly smooth, as if she hadn't so much as rolled over before leaving. I would find her in the kitchen, sitting at the small island, a yellow legal pad open before her. She wasn't writing anymore. She was scraping. She had an old bone-handled paring knife from the drawer, and she would slowly, rhythmically draw the edge of the blade across the blue lines of the paper, shaving off microscopic layers of pulp until the surface was fuzzy and gray. "The ink goes all the way through," she said to me on a Tuesday morning. The sun wasn't even up. The sky outside the window was that pale, greasy gray that precedes a coastal storm. "It's not on the paper, Julian. It's in it. Like it grew there." "Clara, look at me," I said, staying near the sink, keeping the island between us. I hadn't touched her in 6 days. Every time my hand got within 6 inches of her skin, the tiny hairs on the back of my neck would stiffen, the way they do when you stand too close to an old CRT television set. I checked the bank statements. I went down to the branch on Broughton Street. There is no charge for a jeweler. There is no record of that ring being purchased on my account. She didn't look up from her scraping. The knife went shhhgay, shhhgay, shhhgay against the yellow pad. A tiny pile of yellow dust was accumulating near her left wrist. "Of course the bank doesn't have it," she whispered. Her voice had lost that light, musical quality it used to have when we first met at the university library. It was dry now, like 2 pieces of sandpaper rubbing together in a drawer. "They only keep records of things that happen in the light. Your grandfather understood that. He didn't use banks for the real transactions. He used the floor. My grandfather lived in Ohio, Clara. He was a Methodist minister. He never set foot in Georgia." She stopped the knife. The blade remained pressed against the paper, tilting slightly. Finally, she raised her head. Her eyes were bloodshot. The whites yellowed around the edges from lack of sleep, but the pupils were tiny, 2 black pinpricks in a sea of muddy hazel. "Then why is his name on the deed for the annex?" she asked. She didn't wait for my reaction. She reached into the pocket of her oversized linen cardigan, the one that used to belong to her mother, and pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't an old document. It was a fresh, crisp photocopy of a land registry page from 1983, stamped with the blue ink of the Chatham County Records Office. I didn't want to look at it. Every instinct I had as an archivist, the professional drive to examine, to verify, to categorize, was screaming at me to turn away, to go back upstairs, to pack my leather valise, and walk until I hit the salt marshes. But the eye is a treacherous muscle. It seeks the light, even when the light is burning. My eyes dropped to the names at the bottom of the page. Grantor, Arthur de Morville. Grantee, Reverend Thomas Vance. The date was November 12th, 1983. "It's a coincidence," I said, but my voice lacked the weight of my own conviction. My tongue felt large and dry in my mouth. "Thomas Vance is a common name. There are thousands of Vances in the South." He signed it with a cross inside a circle. "Julian," Clara said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic sing-song cadence that made my stomach turn. "The same cross he used to ink into the inside of your childhood shoes, so you wouldn't walk into the ditches. You told me about that on our second date. You laughed about it. You said the old man was terrified of the damp." She stood up then, the knife still held loosely in her right hand. She didn't look angry. She looked terribly, horribly logical, like a math teacher explaining a simple equation to a dull child. "He wasn't afraid of the ditches," she whispered, walking toward the hall closet. "He was afraid of what comes up when the water gets high. He came here to help my grandfather hide it, and then they built the walls around it. If you live in an old house long enough, you begin to understand that it has a memory. It holds the shape of the feet that pressed it. It retains the oil from the palms that gripped the banisters. But by October, our house didn't feel like it was remembering the past. It felt like it was actively recalculating it. I started finding things in my own pockets. I would reach for my keys in the morning, and my fingers would brush against something small and cold, a brass screw that didn't match any fixture in our home, or a square of old, greasy newspaper containing a clipping about a missing child from a town in South Carolina I'd never heard of. The date on the clipping was always the same, June 1982. I didn't put them there. I knew I didn't. I live a life of rigid, almost pathological order. My socks were rolled by color. My research notes were indexed using a modified library system. I was a man who knew exactly where his keys were at 3:15 p.m. on a Thursday. And yet, there the clipping was. "You're doing it in your sleep," my colleague at the society, Dr. Thorne, told me when I showed him the paper over lunch. We were sitting at a small square table outside a cafe on Bull Street, the Spanish moss hanging above us like gray hair. Eris was 60, a man whose skin looked like old parchment himself, his fingers perpetually stained with tobacco and ink. It's classic feud behavior, Julian. The stress of the house, the inheritance, your wife's, historical eccentricities. You're visiting the archives at night. I've seen the logs. Your keycard was used twice last week after midnight. I stared at him, my fork suspended halfway to my plate. The sun was hot on my neck, but inside my chest, that cold, gray stone was growing larger. "My keycard," I repeated. "Eris, I haven't left the house after 9 o'clock in 3 months. I've been with Clara." Eris took a slow sip of his chicory coffee, his eyes fixed on the traffic moving around the square. "The log doesn't lie, my boy. Thursday night, 1:14 a.m. Entered via the basement door. Left at 2:40 a.m. The system registered your specific 5-digit PIN. If it wasn't you, then someone has your wallet. Or your wife does." "Clara doesn't know my PIN," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I remembered her sitting at the mahogany table, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the laptop, her fingers moving over the keys with that strange, automated precision. Had she been tracking me? Or had she been creating me? When I got home that afternoon, the front door was unlocked. The brass latch, which usually required a firm twist of the wrist, was hanging loose, its internal spring apparently snapped. The house was entirely silent, but the smell, that sweet, kerosene and lavender smell from the attic, was so thick in the entry hall that I could taste it on the back of my throat. "Clara," I called out. No answer. Only the rhythmic, metallic clink, clink, clink of the water heater in the basement. I walked down the hall, toward the kitchen. The yellow legal pad was still on the island, but the knife was gone. In its place sat an old leather-bound ledger I recognized instantly. It was the registry of births and deaths from the St. Jude's Parish, covering the years 1975 to 1985. It was an artifact from the Historical Society's restricted vault, the one that required a 2-man key authorization to remove. The book was open to the month of August, 1982. There were 12 entries on the page, all written in the fine, copperplate script of the old parish clerk. But the 9th entry had been altered. Someone had used a razor blade to cleanly slice out a 2-inch strip of the parchment, leaving a rectangular window that looked down onto the wood of our kitchen island below. Through the hole in the paper, written directly onto the white laminate of our countertop in black Sharpie, were 2 words. Our son. I didn't find Clara until dusk. She wasn't in the house. She was in the narrow, brick-walled alleyway that ran between our property and the Oglethorpe Club next door, a space no wider than 3 feet, filled with discarded palmetto fronds and the rusting condenser units of old air conditioners. She was kneeling on the damp earth at the very end of the passage, where the brick walls met at a sharp, 90-degree angle. Her hands were deep in the mud, digging with a frantic, animal intensity. She had discarded the knife. She was using her bare fingers, her nails torn back to the quick, the dark coastal soil caked black under her skin. "Clara," I shouted, grabbing her by the waist and pulling her back. She was surprisingly heavy, her body rigid as an iron bar. When she turned her face to me, the skin was covered in streaks of black mud, and her lips were pulled back from her teeth in a tight, dry grimace that looked like a smile but wasn't. "He's right here, Julian," she whispered, her fingers clawing at my sleeves, leaving dark, wet streaks on my linen shirt. "The willow tree from the letter. It was in the yard. They cut it down in '85 when they built the garage. But the roots are still here. They're under the brick. They're growing into the cellar. Stop it. You're hurting yourself." I yelled, pinning her arms to her sides. "He doesn't have a name in the book," she said, her voice rising, becoming thin and shrill like a whistle. "They took his name out so the water wouldn't find him. Your grandfather took the name, and my grandfather took the body. They split the weight between them, Julian. But we're the ones who have to pay the interest. There is no boy, Clara." I screamed into her face, my own voice breaking with a mixture of terror and an anger I didn't know I possessed. "We don't have a son. We've never had a child. We've been married 7 years, and you've never even been pregnant." She stopped struggling. Her body went entirely slack in my arms, so suddenly that I nearly dropped her onto the muddy bricks. She looked up at me, her small, pinprick pupils dilating until her eyes were almost completely black. "I know," she whispered, her breath smelling faintly of iron. "I didn't say he was ours, Julian. I said he was theirs. And he looks exactly like you. The bathroom floor is cold now. The water has reached the baseboard of the hallway, and I can hear the first faint tock, tock, tock from below, the sound of water meeting the plaster of Mr. Henderson's ceiling. I look at the radiator. The corner is sharp, a square of cast iron that has been painted white so many times the detail of the metalwork is lost under the layers of enamel. There is a tiny tuft of Clara's blonde hair stuck to the corner, held there by a drying, dark red crust. Did she fall? I remember the argument. I remember the smell of the water running in the tub. She had been standing by the sink, holding that silver ring between her thumb and forefinger, her face white and twisted into that terrible, logical smile. "If I go under," she had said, "the space won't be missing anymore. The math will balance." I reached for her. I know I reached for her. But did I reach out to hold her back? Or did I reach out to push the truth away? My hands are wet. The palms are red, but that could be from the rug. That could be from trying to lift her. Then, from the hallway floorboards, right beneath the edge of the sodden Persian runner, comes that sound again. It's louder now that the water has soaked through the wood. A long, wet breath. And then, a small, child's voice, muffled by 80 feet of brick and 80 years of rot, whispers from the dark. "Daddy." The word doesn't vanish into the room. It settles into the rising water like a drop of ink in milk, swirling and expanding until it taints everything. "Daddy." It's a flat, uninflected sound, devoid of the natural cadence of a living child. It sounds like a word that has been preserved in vinegar, kept intact beneath the floorboards where the air is too thick for decay. My watch says 2:14 a.m. The rhythmic tock, tock, tock from Mr. Henderson's apartment below has suddenly changed pace. It's no longer a dry drop hitting plaster. It's a wet, heavy thud, the sound of structural integrity giving way. In less than 2 minutes, his hallway light fixture will short out, and he will take his aluminum walking cane, step out into the corridor, and begin the 3-flight ascent to my door. I look down at Clara. The water has lifted a few strands of her hair, making them float around her pale forehead like fine, golden weeds in a stagnant pond. Her mouth is slightly open, and a tiny bubble of air escapes her blue lips, popping with a microscopic snip against the surface of the flood. I need to move her. If they find her here, in the bathroom, with the tub overflowing and her skull cracked against the radiator, the narrative writes itself. But if she is found in the cellar, if she is found in that missing 82 square feet she spent the last 3 months measuring, then the story becomes something else. It becomes an accident of history. It becomes the house reclaiming its own. The descent into the cellar of 214 East Jones Street is not a matter of steps. It is a transition of climate. By late October, while the rest of Savannah was pretending to feel the first cool drafts of autumn, our basement remained locked in a perpetual July, a dense, greasy heat that smelled of wet lime, old coal dust, and the sour fat of animals that had crawled between the foundations to die. 2 weeks before the water filled the tub, I found a first real discrepancy in my own archives. I was sitting in the research room at the Historical Society, the green-shaded banker's lamps casting long, jaundiced shadows across my desk. Eris Thorne had left for the evening, his pipe smoke still hanging in the upper corners of the room like stale gray lace. My keycard log sat on the blotter before me, a 3-page printout of every time my specific 5-digit PIN had bypassed the security doors between midnight and dawn. I hadn't been sleeping. My eyes were rimmed with a dry, red crust, and my fingers had begun to peel around the cuticles, the skin coming off in thin, translucent ribbons. I looked at the entry for October 14th, 2:11 a.m. Vault 4, uncatalogued estates. Vault 4 was where we kept the crates that hadn't been opened since the society moved from the old custom house in 1974. These were the papers of families that had died out entirely. No heirs to claim them, no historical significance to justify the cost of indexing. The de Morville papers were supposed to be in Vault 2. I stood up, my chair legs screeching against the linoleum with a sound that made my teeth ache. The building was completely empty, save for the night guard, an elderly man named Arthur who spent his shifts listening to baseball games on a transistor radio in the lobby. The air in the basement corridor was cold, moving in slow, rhythmic pulses that smelled faintly of the river. I slipped my keycard into the slot of all 4. The LED light didn't turn green immediately. It flickered yellow for 3 seconds, a long, mechanical hesitation, before the heavy iron latch clicked open with a sound like a pistol cocking. Inside, the room was lined with floor-to-ceiling steel shelving, packed with gray cardboard boxes that had grown bowed and soft under the weight of decades of humidity. The dust here wasn't gray. It was white, a fine, powdery residue that looked like pulverized bone. I didn't have to look for the box. It was already sitting on the small, rolling table in the center of the aisle, as if the previous researcher had left it out for me. On the lid, written in the heavy, grease pencil black of my own society's cataloging style, was a single number, 82-004. I pulled back the cardboard flaps. The smell that came out was instantaneous, and it didn't belong in an archive. It was the smell of our house, the sweet, kerosene and lavender wrought of the third-floor wainscoting. Inside the box were 12 small, black plastic film canisters, the kind Kodak used to sell in the late 20th century. Each canister was numbered with a strip of white medical tape. Beside them lay a small, battery-operated tape recorder from the 1980s, its plastic casing yellowed and brittle, the dual-spool cassette inside frozen mid-turn. I didn't touch the recorder. I reached for the canister, Mark 7. When I pulled off the plastic lid, there was no film inside. There was a tooth. It was a small, white human bicuspid, the root completely intact, but the crown had been drilled through with a tiny, precise hole, as if someone had intended to hang it from a string. Around the root, wrapped 3 times and tied with a neat jeweler's knot, was a single strand of coarse, dark hair. I held it up to the green light of the banker's lamp. My hand was steady now, not because I was calm, but because the coldness that had been growing in my chest since August had finally reached my wrists. Julian. The voice didn't come from behind me. It came from the tape recorder on the table. The spools hadn't moved. The little plastic gears were still frozen, their teeth clogged with gray lint. But the tiny percussive speaker on the side of the unit was vibrating, a dry, paper-thin rattle that formed words out of the static. "Julian, don't look under the willow," the speaker whispered. It was Clara's voice, but it was younger, much younger, the voice of a girl who hadn't yet learned how to steady her breath when she was frightened. "The Reverend says the water is only 4 inches from the floorboards now. If you open the tin, he'll know you're the one who let it out." I dropped the tooth. It hit the metal surface of the rolling table with a sharp, clear ping that seemed to echo down the long, empty aisles of the vault for minutes. When I returned to Jones Street that night, Clara was sitting on the cellar stairs. She had a flashlight between her knees, its yellow beam directed down into the darkness of the old coal bunker. The air down there was so thick with moisture that the light looked like a solid bar of amber, suspended in the grease of the room. "They didn't build the annex to keep something in, Julian," she said as I closed the heavy oak door behind me. She didn't turn around to look at me. Her back was hunched forward, her spine a sharp ridge beneath her damp shirt. "They built it to balance the weight." "Clara, we're leaving," I said, my voice dead, flat, empty of any room for argument. "We're going to a hotel on the beach. Tonight. I don't care about the house. I don't care about your grandfather's will. Look at the foundation," she whispered. She stood up, dropping the flashlight. It didn't break. It rolled down 3 steps, its beam illuminating the bottom of the cellar wall where the old hand-molded brick met the gray, Savannah mud. The bricks weren't red anymore. They had turned a deep, glistening black, covered in a thick, velvety layer of fungus that seemed to be moving, very slowly, in time with the rhythm of the water heater. But it wasn't the fungus that caught my breath. Someone had carved into the mortar. Not with a knife or a chisel. The marks were too wide, too irregular. They had been made by fingers. The lime had been dug out while it was still soft, 40 years ago, leaving long, deep grooves that formed names. Thomas Vance, Arthur de Morville, the boy, and beneath them, written in a hand that was so fresh the lime dust was still white on the floor below it. Julian. I didn't write that, I said, stepping backward until my shoulders hit the cold wood of the cellar door. Clara, I swear to God, I haven't been down here since we moved in. I know you didn't write it, she said, finally turning to face me. She was holding something in her left hand, the bone-handled paring knife from the kitchen. Her palm was entirely split open, a deep, clean line that ran from the base of her index finger to the meat of her wrist. The blood wasn't dripping. It was thick, blackish red, and it was oozing out slowly, like grease from a hot engine. You didn't write it because you haven't finished it yet, she said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly soft, reasonable tone. The Reverend said the third name always takes the longest. It has to grow through the brick from the other side. What other side? I screamed, my hands flying out to grip her shoulders. The moment my fingers touched her linen shirt, I realized she wasn't cold anymore. She was burning. Her skin felt like the top of an iron stove that had been left tending all night. She didn't flinch from my grip. She didn't drop the knife. The 82 feet, she whispered, her eyes wide, black, and completely empty of light. The space where you were before you were born, Julian. The space where my mother went when she stopped talking to the walls. It's right behind the radiator. And now we are here, in the bathroom, and the space is no longer missing. I can hear Mr. Henderson's cane on the stairs now. Thump, tap, thump, tap. He's on the second floor landing. He's moving slow, his old artificial hips squeaking with every step, but he's coming. I slide my arms under Clara's body. She is lighter than she should be, as if the water has already taken most of her density, leaving only the shell of her linen clothes and the cold, wet marble of her skin. Her head lolls back against my bicep, her mouth gaping wider, the dark blood from her scalp smear across my forearm in a long, greasy trail. I drag her out of the bathroom, through the standing water of the hallway, and toward the kitchen. The sound of her heels dragging against the pine floorboards is a wet, scraping scrrrcch that seems to fill the entire house. Julian. The whisper doesn't come from the cellar this time. It comes from the front door. The brass latch, the one that had broken that afternoon, is rattling. Someone is turning the knob from the outside, slowly, methodically, with the practiced patience of a man who knows that doors eventually give way if you apply the weight correctly. I stop in the middle of the kitchen, Clara's body heavy in my arms. Through the frosted glass of the entry door, I can see a silhouette. It's not Mr. Henderson. It's too tall, too broad in the shoulders, and it's wearing a wide-brimmed hat that cuts the light from the street lamp into a sharp, dark wedge. The silhouette doesn't knock. It just leans its forehead against the glass, and through the old, imperfect panes, I can see two wide, pale circles where its eyes should be. They don't have pupils. They are white, blank, and they are looking directly at the bundle in my arms. The cane on the stairs has stopped. There's only the sound of the front door knob turning, click, 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 and the long, wet breath rising from the floor beneath my feet, waiting for me to make the math balance. The silhouette against the frosted glass doesn't knock, because a shadow has no knuckles. It simply presses its weight against the wood, a dull, heavy lean that makes the old mortise lock groan within its pine frame. On the stairs outside, the sound of Mr. Henderson's cane has vanished entirely, swallowed by the thick, wet silence that has taken over the stairwell. There is only the drip-drop of the kitchen ceiling below us, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing that seems to be coming from the very plaster of the walls. I am standing in the center of the kitchen, my thighs burning from the dead weight of Clara's body. Her linen trousers are completely saturated now, dripping cold, pinkish water onto my bare feet. If I drop her, the sound will alert whatever is standing on the porch. If I hold her, my arms will fail in less than 2 minutes. Julian, a voice calls through the door. It isn't the child's voice from the floorboards, and it isn't Clara's sandpaper whisper. It's a voice I know better than my own, a deep, resonant baritone with the dry, scratchy edge of tobacco smoke and 60 years of Georgia dust. It is Eris Thorne. Julian, open the door, my boy, he says, his tone calm, steady, entirely too normal for a man standing on a porch at 2:16 in the morning while water pours through the floor. I have the rest of the ledger. The pages from 82. I know what you're trying to do with the floorboards, Julian. It won't balance. Not without the third signature. The mind under extreme psychological pressure does not break. It simplifies. It discards everything that cannot immediately serve to keep the lungs moving and the heart beating. As I stood there in the dark kitchen, the blue glare of Clara's closed laptop looking like a small, square gravestone on the island, the pieces of the last 7 years didn't fall into place. They fractured. Eris Thorne hadn't been my mentor. He had been my keeper. 3 days before Clara fell, I had gone into the basement archive of the Historical Society while Eris was at a trustee luncheon. I wasn't looking for the de Morville deeds anymore. I was looking for my own personnel file. I wanted to know why a man with a master's degree from Princeton and 2 published monographs on colonial architecture had been hired by a small, underfunded county society in Georgia for a salary that barely covered the rent on a Jones Street townhouse. The file wasn't in the administrative cabinet. It was in the back of Vault 4, inside the same gray box, 82-004, where I had found the film canisters and the child's tooth. The folder was thin, consisting of only 3 documents. The first was a medical report from the Savannah General Hospital, dated August 14, 1982. It detailed the admission of an unnamed male infant, approximately 4 months old, suffering from severe dehydration, and what the attending physician described as environmental staining. The skin of the child's legs and lower torso had been dyed a deep, indelible gray from prolonged exposure to wet lime and coal dust. The child had no birth certificate, no footprint record, and no legal guardian. The second document was an adoption decree, signed by a judge who had died in a single-car accident 3 weeks after the ink dried. The adoptive parent wasn't my grandfather, the Reverend Thomas Vance. It was Eris Thorne. The third document was a letter, handwritten on the blue-lined legal paper that Clara had spent her final weeks scraping with the paring knife. Eris, the letter read, the handwriting identical to the script that now marked the bottom of my cellar wall. The boy is too loud. Thomas says the floor won't hold him if the water gets past the 4th course of brick. We've given him the Vance name for the registry, but you must keep him in the dark until the de Morville girl is old enough. They have to come back to the house together. The blood has to know where the missing space is. The letter was signed with a cross inside a circle. But it wasn't my grandfather's mark. I looked at the bottom of the page, my fingers shaking so violently that the cheap paper tore slightly in my grip. Beside the cross was a small, purple ink smudge, the distinct 3-pronged print of a thumb that had been deformed by an old printing press accident. It was Eris Thorne's thumb. Julian. The voice through the frosted glass grows louder, losing its professional warmth, hardening into something flat and bureaucratic. The neighbor has already called the precinct. The water is through his ceiling, Julian. If they find you in there with her, the archives won't be able to protect you. They'll look at the ledger. They'll see the dates. You built this. I whisper toward the door, my voice cracking. I don't know if he can hear me through the heavy oak, but the silhouette shifts, its head tilting slightly to the left. The house, the inheritance. You set Clara up to find that tin. You knew she couldn't leave her rattle alone. The house was always hers. Julian, Eris says through the glass. His breath leaves a small, oval patch of condensation on the pane. And the space beneath, it was always yours. Her grandfather didn't leave it to her on a condition. He left it to her as a prison sentence. He just forgot to tell her who the guard was. With a sudden, sickening surge of clarity, I looked down at Clara's face. The emotional climax of a man's life is rarely a scream. It is the silent, freezing realization that every choice he thought he made out of love was actually dictated by a string that was tied to his spine before he had a name. I didn't marry Clara because we met in that library. I married her because my skin smelled of the lime in her basement, and her blood knew the geometry of the 82 square feet that had been stolen from my childhood. She hadn't been gaslighting me. She had been trying to dig me out. Every pattern she found, every land map she digitized, every drop of blood she drew from her own palm onto that basement wall. It wasn't madness. It was an engineering problem. She was trying to build a bridge across the 40-year gap between the boy on the porch and the husband in her bed. "Julian," she whispers. The body in my arms doesn't move. Her eyes remain fixed, her jaw slack. But the sound comes from her throat anyway, a low vibration that hums against my bicep. "Julian, the knife is in your pocket." I freeze. My right hand leaves her knees, sliding down into the pocket of my trousers. My fingers brush against the smooth, bone handle of the paring knife. It's warm, unbearably warm, like an object that has been sitting in the sun on a midsummer afternoon. I didn't put it there. I know I didn't. The third name. Her throat vibrates, the water in her mouth bubbling slightly. "It doesn't go on the brick, Julian. It goes into the water. You have to finish the equation." The front door gives a sharp, violent crack. The wood around the brass strike plate has finally splintered. A single, dark finger's breadth of space opens between the door and the frame, and through it, the smell of the alleyway hits the kitchen. Not the smell of Savannah, but the ancient, sour reek of Vault 4, mixed with the wet, heavy scent of a willow tree that was cut down before I was born. "Julian," Eris shouts, his shoulder hitting the oak with a rhythmic, heavy thud. Boom, boom, boom. The police are turning onto Jones Street. I can hear the tires on the wet brick. "Open the door, or I'll let the water take the whole floor." I don't look at the door. I turn toward the hall that leads to the cellar stairs. I'm no longer an archivist. I am a man carrying a bundle of wet linen and broken bone down into a hole that has been waiting 44 years for the measurements to come out even. As my foot hits the first wooden step of the basement stairs, the flashlight at the bottom, the one Clara dropped, flickers once, twice, and then dies, leaving nothing but the thick, hot dark and the sound of the water following us down, step by step, like a dog at its master's heel. The transition from the fifth step to the seventh is where the light from the upper world dies completely. In the absolute black of the coal cellar, the water is no longer a localized phenomenon. It is a rising tide, a thick, greasy soup that tastes of lime, rotted heartwood, and the iron-rich silt of the Savannah River. It has already reached my waist, pulling at the wool of my trousers like hundreds of tiny, wet fingers, dragging me down into the soft, unmapped mud of the foundation. Above me, the kitchen door finally explodes inward. The sound is a distant, wooden crack, followed by the heavy, rhythmic slosh of Eris Thorne's boots entering the hallway. "Julian!" His voice drops down the stairwell, stripped of its scholarly veneer, hollow and dry as an empty cistern. "The police are in the square, Julian. If you stay down there, the hydrostatic pressure will lock that door from the outside. You'll be a historical footnote by morning." I don't answer him. I am kneeling in the mud at the base of the chimney breast, the water rising to my chest, my arms still cradling the light, waterlogged frame of my wife. The final reveal of a lifetime of deception is never a document. It is an orientation of space. As my hands scrape against the wet, blackened brickwork of the cellar wall, looking for the grooves Clara had described, my fingers hit something that doesn't belong in a foundation. It isn't brick, and it isn't mortar. It is a smooth, circular piece of lead, about the size of a silver dollar, embedded directly into the central pier of the house. I press my thumb against it. The metal is soft, giving slightly under the pressure of my knuckle, and, as it shifts, a small, hollow thunk echoes through the masonry. The wall doesn't slide open like a secret door in a Gothic novel. It fractures. A vertical fissure, no wider than a man's forearm, splits the brickwork from the mud floor to the cedar joists above. And from that fissure, the true smell of 214 East Jones Street escapes. It isn't the smell of rot. It is the smell of a clean, dry room that has been kept at precisely 68 degrees and 40% humidity for 44 years. It is the smell of an active darkroom. I reach into the gap, my fingers brushing against something smooth, cold, and metallic. A light switch. When I flip it, the space inside doesn't flood with white light. It activates a low, amber safe light that cuts through the moisture of the cellar like a hot wire through fat. It is the missing 82 square feet. The room is narrow, barely 6 feet wide, lined with stainless steel developing trays, chemical bottles bearing labels from the Eastman Kodak Company that expired in 1983, and row upon row of steel wires stretching from wall to wall. Hanging from those wires, held by small wooden clothespins, are thousands of black and white photographs. They aren't pictures of the de Morville family. They aren't historical records of Savannah. They are pictures of me. There is a photograph of me at age 6, sitting on a tricycle in a yard I don't remember, my eyes wide, white and pupilless. There is a photograph of me at 12, standing outside a brick schoolhouse in Ohio, my face blurred out by a chemical stain. There is a photograph of me at 22, sitting in the Princeton Library, and right behind me, his hand resting on the back of my chair, is Eris Thorne. And on the central processing table, beneath a heavy glass weight, sits the original logbook of the St. Jude's Parish for August 1982. The page hasn't been cut out by a razor blade. The entry for the 9th child was never written in the book at all. The 2-inch strip of parchment that Clara had found missing wasn't an omission. It was a flap, a false bottom built into the ledger itself. I lift the parchment flap with my muddy index finger. Beneath it, written in the crisp, elegant copperplate of the old parish clerk, is the name that should have been mine. Child name, Julian de Morville. Father, Arthur de Morville. Mother, Clara de Morville, Sr. The water behind me gives a sudden, violent heave. Eris Thorne is standing at the entrance of the fissure. He is soaked to the shoulders, his expensive tweed jacket hanging off his frame like wet moss, his face illuminated by the amber glow of the safe light. In his right hand, he isn't holding a ledger or a cane. He is holding an old, nickel-plated revolver, the barrel pitted with rust, but the cylinder clean and bright. You weren't adopted from a hospital, Julian, Eris says, his breath coming in short, rattling gasps. Arthur didn't want an heir. He wanted a clean slate. When your mother died in that bathroom upstairs in '82, he realized the house was too heavy for one family to carry. So he split you. You took me. I whisper, my back against the photograph wires. The pictures of my childhood are brushing against my wet neck like dead leaves. We took the name and the blood, and we put them in Ohio with a man who knew how to pray, Eris says, stepping into the narrow room. The water follows him, a dark, greasy tongue that begins to coat the stainless steel tables. And we kept the girl here, so she could grow into the property. The will was written before you could walk, Julian. You had to come back. The house won't settle until the 2 lines meet in the grout. And Clara. I look down at the bundle in my arms. Her face is completely submerged now, her hair floating in the amber light like liquid gold. Clara was an architect, Eris says, raising the revolver until the dark circle of the barrel is lined up with the bridge of my nose. She understood symmetry. She knew that if you had 82 feet to one side of a house, you have to take it from the other. She didn't fall, Julian. You know she didn't fall. You held her under until the air stopped coming out. The mind under ultimate pressure does not deny its crimes. It accepts their utility. I look at my hands. The skin is caked in black mud, but beneath the mud, the fingers are long, elegant, and perfectly suited for the fine work of organizing the dead. I remember the bathroom now. I remember the sound of the water running. I remember her looking at me with those tiny, pimpered pupils and saying, "The math will balance." I didn't push her. She didn't slip. We simply stood in the water together until the weight of the past became greater than the structural integrity of the floorboards, and then I let her head find the iron. Not out of malice, not out of jealousy, but because I am an archivist, and some records cannot be preserved unless they are completely saturated. Eris, I say softly. The police are at the door. Julian, he repeats, his thumb drawing back the hammer of the revolver with a double click that sounds like a dry twig snapping. Give me the knife. I reach into my pocket. My fingers find the bone handle of the paring knife. It is no longer warm. It is cold, colder than the water, colder than the marble of the bathroom floor. I don't pull it out to strike him. I drop it. The small blade hits the surface of the rising water with a clean, vertical plop, sinking instantly into the mud between my feet. And as it hits the floor, the rhythmic breathing from the wall stops. The silence that follows is absolute. It is the frequency of the skull against cast iron, expanded to fill the entire 4 floors of the townhouse. Then, from the ceiling of the safe light room, a small, dark crack appears in the plaster. It doesn't drop water. It drops lime, a fine, white powder that falls onto Eris's shoulders like snow. The third name, I whisper, looking at the wall behind him where the fresh grooves in the mortar are already beginning to fill with black mud. It wasn't Julian Vance, Eris. And it wasn't Julian de Morville. The revolver doesn't fire. The firing pin hits a damp primer with a dull, hollow click. Before he can pull the hammer back a second time, the floor beneath his boots gives way entirely. The 82 square feet of missing space doesn't have a foundation. It sits directly over the old brick-lined well that Arthur de Morville had used to dump the chemical waste from his darkroom in 1982. The intake of air isn't a breath anymore. It's a suction. Eris Thorne vanishes into the mud without a scream, his tweed jacket ballooning around his arms like the wings of a large, drowning bird before the black silk closes over his hat. The revolver drops into the water, hitting the lead seal on the central pier with a final, metallic clink. I am sitting on the third step of the cellar stairs now. The water has stopped rising. It has found its level, exactly 3 inches below the kitchen floorboards, just as the note on the yellow legal pad predicted 44 years ago. Outside, the sirens have stopped. There are no flashing red lights through the frosted glass of the kitchen door. There are no boots on the stairs. There is only the quiet, steady drip, drip, drip from Mr. Henderson's ceiling below, a sound that has become so regular it feels like the ticking of a grandfather clock in an empty hallway. I have the black and white photograph in my hand, the one of the 4-year-old boy on the porch. The water has soaked through the paper, dissolving the chemical emulsion until the image is almost entirely gone, leaving nothing but a white, blank rectangle. But if you hold it up to the light of the kitchen window, where the first pale streaks of dawn are finally beginning to cut through the Savannah humidity, you can see the watermark in the paper. It isn't a manufacturer's logo. It's a signature, written in a fine, elongated cursive that I recognize from every grocery list, every land map, and every mirror in this house. "Don't look for the boy," it says. "He's already holding the door."